All right. This is Kylo Goings doing the Advanced Design Project presentation, and the system I decided to design was an alchemy system. So, what is the alchemy system? It's essentially where I'm saying the player would be able to find elements around the map, whether it be like wood, fire, water, um, and metal, and they would be able to infuse it with their equipment or their weapon system. This would give the player new abilities, along with allowing them to kind of enjoy new puzzle mechanics to help them traverse through the level. So some of the combinations that are going to be showcased is the mostly the guns. So it's going to be the fire gun, which is the Inferno shooter, the metal gun, which is the Thunder cannon, and some of the puzzle mechanics. So the fire gun allows you to shoot fire projectiles along with setting enemies and the environment ablaze. The gun will transform into an electricity charged cannon, dealing some AoE damage and stunning enemies. Um, and some of the puzzle mechanics you can solve using these, one is the overgrown path that requires you to use the Inferno shooter to clear the path and burn down vegetation, along with the electronically sealed door, which requires you to power it up using the Thunder cannon. So I'm going to first explain the system, and then I'm going to play the system to showcase all the different features that are in there. These are some of the features that I said would be on my feature lock list that I did not get to showcase, but I still want to show some of the thought process that went into it and why I decided to change my design philosophy later on. There's supposed to be a sword aspect where you can fuse wood and water to create different swords, a nature blade and an aqua blade, and this would also help you solve different puzzle mechanics such as the wooden barrier to like melt it down with the poison, or the ice barrier to melt it down and get through it. So how it basically works is that you have four pickup items. There's only gonna be three displayed in the system, and two that are functioning in the system. There's the wood, water, fire, and metal. The ones you will see is going to be the fire one and the electric one, which is metal. The equipment is the original rifle, which is the one in the first person character, along with a BP sword, which is an asset that I pulled in from another asset package that I already owned. So the technical design for the gun combinations is basically the Inferno shooter and the Thunder cannon. So essentially, what ends up happening is that once you fuse the element to the gun, it changes the projectile. So you have the original projectile, which is already inside the project, and then once you fuse it with fire, it makes the projectile red, signifying the fire cannon. And then you also have the projectile turning it's like a glowing yellow to signify the thunder cannon mechanic. So the technical design for some of the puzzles is the electronically sealed door, the target acting enemies, and the overgrown wall. I named it wrong when I made the BP. I made a wooden wall. I meant to name it overgrown path, but same effect either way. It basically with the overgrown path, like I said, you shoot it, it burns away, and then with this electronically sealed door, when you shoot it with the thunder cannon, it opens up the path. Enemies can also be stunned, burned, frozen, and poisoned with these weapons. So this is an overview of the fire damage and the poison damage, um, which I tried to be cool and basically come up with some math for it. But I essentially use the same logic across all of them. So I'm just going to explain one, and essentially they're all using the same logic base. So for the fire one, it's essentially the enemy or the obstacle has a burn threshold, so how much fire they're able to resist before they start burning. So for like the firewall, once it hits its burn threshold, or the burn or the amount they've been burned reduces their burn threshold, I should say. And once the burn threshold hits zero, they start to burn, which is determined by a bool. This is used across the other mechanics as well for the ice and the electricity. The only one I guess is a little bit different is the poison. The poison is supposed to be poison damage like over time. So essentially, how depending on how many times the players hit, so how much damage points they receive, we multiply that number to get however much damage they receive, and then that damage is done over the course of a timer. So, like I said, the ice and the electricity work exactly the same. The only difference is that they stop the enemies from moving and they freeze them and slash stun them. So this is some of that logic in engine of how it works. Like I said, it's a lot of the exact same. It's basically copy and paste. So it's essentially just, taking the threshold, subtracting it for however much damage they received. It determines if they're frozen. And then I have a print string that tells me that the enemy's frozen. Same thing for damage. I have the same thing where it tells me if they've gotten hit. So electronic projectiles. So I wanted it to have an AOE effect. A work around I found for that, or not a workaround, but the solution I found to that was to use impulse. It was my first time using impulse. I really didn't know what I was getting into with it. I really think looking back at it, creating like some sort of sphere trace for radial damage around wherever the object hit would have been better. But I stuck with the impulse, and it got somewhat of a desired effect, which I'll show later on. So this was the sword trace. It shows that it's tracing, but for some reason, I just couldn't get it to work. My mistake was that I've never used sword trace in first person, and I should have thought about that before jumping into it. And I unfortunately had to abandon the mechanic because I figured it was better to sacrifice it and just benefit the rest of the system rather than focus on it and basically not have a fully fledged system. So this is some of the sword trace logic that I tried to apply to it, which follows a lot of the same logic later on that I'll show with the gun. So the fusing mechanic is essentially where you just fuse the element to the gun, and the player can basically check which element that they have. They can decide to fuse the element, which is them just switching a bool on and off, and they can reset it. So essentially getting rid of their element or setting the enum to true, which allows them to have um, a fresh start on which element they pick up next. If, however, if the player does pick up an element while they're using their gun, it'll essentially fuse with the gun automatically if they're currently fusing. If not, the gun will still retain its previous element infusion, along with the player still having the element that they recently picked up. But if the player weapons break, because that's also part of the mechanic too, is that the player's weapons and equipment does break to encourage them to kind of keep looking for new elements along the way. So this is some of that blueprint logic as well. I also had the enemies kind of drop some of these elements too whenever they got killed. So this is the technical design features for this electronically sealed puzzle, which follows the exact same logic as like stunning for the enemies, but instead at this point it's a charge amount. So essentially, once the door reaches a charge amount by being hit with electricity, three lights come on by changing materials on some cubes, and then that sets a timeline that makes the door open. Same with the overgrown wall. Um, it follows essentially the same thing. Once it hits its threshold, it burns away, which is just destroying the actor. So how I changed each of the projectiles is that I did it in a very messy way. I could have done it cleaner, but essentially what I did is that I had each of the materials be set differently along with different damage types based on whatever enum the player had equipped. The only thing that was consistent is that the amount of damage that those weapons would do, like their elemental damage, was based on the gun's damage. And these are all my enums. Um, Enemies did the same thing where basically all their stuff would cause not their stuff, but the enemy could either be stunned, burned, um, or no, that was it, just stunned or burned. And essentially, when they were stunned or burned, there was an effect on their bodies to show that the stun or the burn was happening. And then this is some of that target AI blueprint logic. So if the AI was moving, it didn't want to cooperate, but if it was moving, you would see that if they're stunned, then they wouldn't be able to move. However, um, if they're not stunned, then the AI should still be able to move. And that's how I simulated stunning. And this is some of that other blueprint logic to check if they're dead, and if they're burning, it sets that timer handle to cause burning damage over time. So with that, I'm going to jump straight into the engine. I'm going to showcase these mechanics. So here I am with the gun. The gun can shoot, and if I shoot it a certain amount of times, the weapon gets destroyed. If I pick up an element and I press my debug key, it says I have metal. If I lose the current element, it sets it to none. Now I'm going to show fusing. If I press the fuse button, so I'm currently fusing elements, but there's no element on my player, so there's nothing for it to fuse with. But if I pick up the silver, it fuses it to be the electronic. When I shoot the enemy, they become stunned, and then they have little sparks that show up. For the door, I'm going to have to shoot it a couple times, so I'm going to do this for a little bit. But the lights will come on, and eventually, after I've shot it enough times, all lights glow, and then the door drops open, moving us on to the next area. So now we got the fire elements, and like I said, works a lot of the same way. So basically, This causes fire damage. So when they get hit, it causes them to catch on fire, right? And then I'm gonna turn off my fusing just to show that if I hit this wall, this is the overgrown wall, with regular bullets, it doesn't burn down, right? I destroyed my weapon. But if I pick up this fire, and again, since I'm not fusing, the fire is not applied to the weapon, but when I hit fuse, it's applied to the weapon, and now I can destroy the firewall. And so the path continues. Um, so this is more or less the overall playthrough, and that's the water. So I can kind of show off the water a little bit just because I think it looks cool. Yeah, the water bullets have a cool effect to them, but that's neither here nor there. That is the system, how it worked out. A lot of the things I learned along the way, along with mistakes that were made, and things that I can definitely do better for the future. Thank you for your time, and have a great one.